So our field is increasingly recognizing that while mental illness itself does not cause targeted violence and terrorism, psychological experiences like human suffering, despair, hopelessness, these often are a part of the picture. And these problems fall under the purview of mental health providers. So given this, we are increasingly seeing referrals to mental health care or other psychosocial supports made as part of threat management plans. I will show my cards. I'm a clinical child psychologist, so I think this is a great idea. But it's also one that is easier said than done. What do you do when someone doesn't want help? What if a family or an individual refuses to engage in treatment? TVT occupies this intersection of both individual well-being and public safety. And as such, if an individual does not voluntarily engage in services, the question needs to be asked: does the failure to engage increase a public safety risk? Do additional measures need to be taken to support engagement? How do you balance personal freedom with public safety? So this is a panel that I wanted to moderate purely out of selfish motivations because I'm really struggling with this issue, and I'm hoping that you guys will solve it. Our team at Boston Children's Hospital regularly runs into this problem of kids don't want to see us. I mean, maybe we're just really bad at what we do, but I think it's beyond that. I think oftentimes the families that have made it to this point where their kid is really struggling, these often are families that have a lot going on, and they may not trust systems, and they may not even notice the problem, or they may totally reject a female provider, or whatever it is. There are often many complex issues that get in the way of kids getting engaged in treatment. Now, I want to back this up against another problem, which is that U.S. attorneys are loath to charge adolescents with a federal crime. So they are often looking for other solutions, even with very risky cases, okay? Local law enforcement sometimes has charges they might bring, but federal, they're not going to do it. So we really need to figure out what do we do for those kids? It's probably not enough to simply suggest that they should go out and get some mental health supports. On our team, referrals are made to us. We're a bunch of mental health clinicians with some interdisciplinary thinking, but fundamentally we are mental health providers. In a more traditional model, the mental health provider gets a referral, they reach out a few times, maybe the family doesn't call back, maybe the family doesn't show up, and that's it. They don't chase clients down for 8 months. It's usually the opposite. It takes 8 months to get off a wait list. But that doesn't really work in this case. If we just sort of take a couple phone calls and then say, well, they didn't come in. Sorry about that super risky kid that now is back out there. So what do we do? So I'm going to share some thinking that I'm doing. This is more like draft thinking, so I'm hoping for some input on it. And then I'm very excited to hear from a couple people who have been living and breathing this in different ways. So I've been thinking about really, and when I get a complex problem, what I like to do is make grids and boxes because it makes me feel safer to have things organized. So I've been thinking about these different levels, and we need to be thinking about risk and engagement together and kind of operating on different levels depending on where those factors lie. Level 1 is the referrals we all want, where it's a kind of lower risk individual. They freely consent to psychosocial supports. If a kid like that or a family like that comes through the threat assessment team, really all you need to do is maybe make some targeted suggestions. The issues of mental health provider capacity in this area can be important. If you have providers who know what we're doing, that helps. Maybe there's a little kind of encouragement around getting into an appointment, but that's all that really needs to be done. But then what if that's not enough and it doesn't take? Then I think the next level is what I think of as education and relationship building. And I actually think a lot can be done if you can staff resource If you can put resources towards, am I towards having someone do the kind of sustained outreach. And what was the term? Relentless outreach? What was it? Relentless follow-up. We have a case that we're actively working with where relentless maybe sounds a little bit hard, but there was 8 months of outreach to this family before the family decided to engage. And this is one of those kids that was super high risk, but there were no legal levers that anyone could pull. And so this was it. They were either going to voluntarily engage or no one was going to be involved in the family. So that does not come free, though. That takes some effort. There are other ways of thinking about this, like education. Sometimes it's a school principal. Sometimes it's a police officer, an SRO, who might sit down with the kid and say, look, if you continue on this path, here are the different ways it could go. And here are some other ways that you could take things that might work better for you. So sometimes that sort of education and relationship building can work. And this is also where I think some programs really nicely bring in people with lived experience, formers who can maybe connect and say, hey, wait, there's some other ways of thinking about this. And so again, none of this is, we're all still in the space of voluntary, okay? This is just how do you resource things to use education and relationship building to help motivate someone. All right, so now some of you might be thinking, that's so sweet, you spent 8 months outreaching to a risky family, but we don't have 8 months sometimes. Like, we've got to do something now. We can't just sit on this while you try these sort of friendly strategies. So this is what I would call level 3, structural encouragement or incentivization. And the basic idea here is we need to find strategies that make it easier to engage than to not engage. So this could include mandates, procedural measures, pressure from involved systems. So thinking about schools or child welfare or court involvement. So I think we need to get creative about what systems are out there and how can we use that to leverage engagement at times. And then finally, there are some cases where you just can't do that. Even that's too slow. And then we're really looking at what are legal enforcement tools. This is where it's no longer voluntary. Something's got to happen. And there are 2 directions that it can go. One is law enforcement with an arrest. There's not always a charge. It's also sometimes a short-term solution that simply kind of amps up the grievance because someone's being taken off the street temporarily, but it doesn't do a whole lot for relationship building potentially. And the other potential route is involuntary commitment. That would be the mental health route. This is also imperfect. I can tell you, you can send someone to the emergency room, and if they aren't actively suicidal or homicidal, they will be sent right back out. Even if they do go inpatient, often that's like 3 days, and then they're sent back out. And again, mental illness, this is not... I think it's sort of more the exception than the rule that you would throw someone on medication with a diagnosis and be able to sort of take away the major problem. Sometimes mental illness contributes to the problem, but it's not something that gets fixed in a 3-day inpatient stay. So again, imperfect solutions. And that's as far as I get. Those are my 4 levels, all of them problematic in different ways. So this is why this is my unsolved problem, and I am really excited to turn to the panel and hear about people who are working in this space in different ways and how you think about some of these issues. So, Amy, can I turn it over to you?
Let me solve all your problems.
I love this.
I'm going to talk about the system that Heidi called imperfect, which, how dare she? No, kidding. It's a very imperfect system of the involuntary mental health system. But first I need to find, oh, here's the clicker. Okay. So I am a psychiatrist. I don't do any outpatient work. I have worked my entire career in spaces where all of my patients, to some degree, were not there voluntarily. I work in the ER where people are brought in on holds. I work in the county crisis unit and psychiatric hospital where I was medical director for a number of years, where people are on long-term holds or conservatorship. And I work in the county jail. The closest I've come to seeing patients voluntarily is patients who were actually in an outpatient program in the jail. Yes, we have an inpatient unit in our jail in Sacramento. So they were not in jail by their own choice, but they did actually come to see me sort of by their own choice. Nonetheless, I operate largely in the compulsory space of mental health care. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens after the 5150, that path that Heidi talked about, where there is not any voluntary engagement, there is not charges that can be pressed by the criminal justice system, and this person is very high risk. For those of you watching from home, not in California, I know the 5150 is our version of an involuntary emergency hold, and you all have your own codes, but I'll try to translate from California speak where I can. So what can the mental health system do, and by that I mean the involuntary mental health system, do to prevent public violence? Can we involuntarily treat people to reduce their violence risk? And this is an important question because, as Heidi mentioned, you can bring the horse to water, as they say, but you can't make them drink. You can bring somebody to the ER, but you can't actually make them take medication. You can't force somebody to engage in 6 months of long-term psychotherapy. You can't shove antidepressants down their throat and hope they take action. These things don't work. So what can we actually do with somebody who is there against their will? And this is not just kind of what we can do, but what is actually treatable in that setting? And I'll talk about that in a minute too. And then the other thing, because the other part of my job is that I'm the associate director of a firearms violence research center, and I do a lot of work around gun violence restraining orders and other firearm issues. And there are some pathways within the involuntary mental health system to prohibit people from owning firearms, but it's important to know exactly what those are and how they happen so that you don't, as many often do, think the person became prohibited and they did not. Or they became prohibited, but they have a whole arsenal at home in their shed that they're just returning back to. So we'll talk a little bit about the 5150 emergency hold application. How many people are familiar with this? Okay, I'm imagining most folks here from public health or mental health and law enforcement know it. This allows you to involuntarily detain someone for evaluation and sort of for treatment. Pretty low threshold, no probable cause hearing happens on a 5150. However, it does not give you the right to give me the right to involuntarily medicate somebody. It gives me the right to assess them and treat them and keep them in a facility. Generally, and there's no firearms prohibition associated with the 5150. There is a little bit where if the person is like holding a gun saying, I'm going to use this to kill myself, law enforcement responds to that scene. They're allowed to remove a firearm that's on their person or in their possession. But if the person kicks out of the system too early, they can get that firearm back. There's no prohibition that is incurred. They could go out and buy a new one. The 5150 theoretically lasts for 3 days. And usually what happens now in California and in most places in the country, it lands you in the emergency department for evaluation by the ER team. Families can bring people in too, but oftentimes it's law enforcement who drops someone off. To be on a 5150 in California, and this is true for every state that I know of, you have to be either dangerous to yourself or dangerous to somebody else, or in California we have a grave disability statute, but that doesn't really apply here. So you don't have to have said specifically that you're going to do something, but people have to be concerned enough to bring you to the attention of the authorities and bring you in. Perhaps surprisingly, we have a lot of people who bring themselves in for involuntary holds. They're put on an involuntary hold and held in the ER. This is like a waiting zone because the real goal is to get them to an inpatient bed, of which there are far too few. And many folks sit and wait and wait and wait in the ER. Their 3 days goes by, more days go by. There's no beds. Maybe it's a holiday. There's still no beds. And eventually the ER team just says, I guess we'll send you back home. So I had a patient recently who was in the ER. She'd made very serious threats of suicide. Law enforcement brought her in, left her gun on her coffee table. She was in the ER with us. There were no beds, there were no beds, there were no beds. She had a couple kind of soft medical problems that when there was a bed that came up, nobody wanted to put her in it anyway. So she was kind of not a popular referral. And eventually she got to the point where she'd been in the ER so long we had to let her go. So we had to send her back home. We knew there was a gun on her coffee table. And she was going to be legally allowed to own it because she hadn't reached the prohibitory threshold. And frankly, we hadn't done anything in those, I think she'd been there like 12 days. We had done nothing to fix her problems that led her to not want to live anymore. And so what I did was I called the law enforcement agency that had brought her in and said, could you please file a gun violence restraining order and get that gun off of her coffee table? If there is a bed, that person may be admitted to an inpatient psychiatric hospital. They have come a long, long way since One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but this is the picture that everybody thinks of when they think of inpatient hospitals. And once they're in the inpatient hospital, their 3 days will run out and they will be put on a second hold called a 5250. This is a 14-day hold. It can be for dangerousness. And importantly, there is a probable cause hearing required within 4 business days of the 5250. And the reason this matters is that it is at that hearing that a firearms prohibition is determined. If the judge upholds the 5250 application and keeps the person in the hospital, that counts as the committed to a mental institution that will incur a firearm prohibition. But still, now this person may have been in my hospital for 3 days and may be in the hospital for 14 more days. I don't have a right to involuntarily medicate this person. So it happens all the time that folks come in, they're there maybe up to 17 days, and they're like, no, I don't want any of your medications, thank you. And they're just there for 17 days. Usually at that point, if we can't get a court order for medication, we discharge them. But it doesn't come with an order to treat. That is a separate hearing. It's something called a Reese hearing that has a higher standard, and we have to go back to court to get that. Again, this is California. The certification or commitment hearing is before a judge. Sometimes we will combine it with the hearing for involuntary medication purposes or the Reese hearing, and we can get both a certification and a Reese, and that does allow us to involuntarily medicate patients who are on a hold. Is this a great way to preserve patient rapport? No. Do we like to do this? No. There are cases, however, in which somebody is sick enough and has lost their capacity to make informed decisions about their own health care that we do this. I just want to talk about the firearms prohibition that can occur at this point. So the Gun Control Act of 1968, which was our first federal law to regulate the firearm industry and owners, had this list of prohibited persons. And the most relevant here is the prohibited persons, oops, I'm gonna go back, that are adjudicated as a mental defective, not really great language, but still on the books, or who've been committed to a mental institution. So you can be in an ER, let's say that you were in the ER for 7 days, and you finally get a bed in an inpatient hospital and you're brought over, and it's a 3-day weekend, and so 4 business days for your hearing finally happens, and at this point you've been in the hospital for, I don't know, 10 or 11 days, maybe even getting treatment this whole time for your mental illness. And at that point, even though you were very, very sick and very dangerous when you came in, you're released because your court hearing is, you've got 11 days of treatment under your belt, you're looking pretty good, and the judge lets you go. You do not reach the threshold of being, quote, committed to a mental institution, and that is when you would then be reported to the NICS database and be prohibited federally from owning a firearm. So it does kind of matter. When you bring somebody into the ER on a 5150, they can still walk back out and buy a gun if they're released from there. California, I should say, does have a state prohibition at the point of admission to an inpatient unit, but most states don't have that. So let's talk a little bit about treatment. So in those cases that Heidi talked about, really high risk, really low engagement, they meet the threshold for involuntary criteria. And I should say that this isn't just everyone who's high risk and low engagement. Somebody who, finds out their wife is sleeping with their best friend and decides to kill them both, and you bring them to me, I'm going to say, this does seem really scary, but I don't really see a treatable mental illness here. And in California, the statute specifies it's due to a mental illness. Now, I'm allowed to, find out if there's perhaps a mental illness behind this, but there are plenty of cases where people are very high risk, and it's very clearly not due to a mental illness. So I could bring that guy in, and he could hang out for 17 days, but he's still going to be mad at his best friend and his wife, so there's nothing I can medicate about that. Other examples of situations where somebody who's making threats of targeted violence may have, as Heidi also mentioned, mental health problems or psychological stressors that are contributing to their risk. So we see a lot of these guys who have a whole smorgasbord of past diagnoses: autism spectrum disorders, anxiety, ADHD, depression. Yes, many of these things, less so autism, but with some sorts of therapies, those things can be treatable, anxiety and depression. But if you bring someone to me who is making these threats and they're depressed, and maybe that's part of their lack of engagement. Let's say the kid that we talked about at lunch, the case that Rachel presented. And I decide, okay, I'm going to treat this guy's depression. Now I have an involuntary medication order. He doesn't want to have anything to do with me or this system, but he's here involuntarily in the hospital, and I have a Reese order. I can medicate him. Well, I'm still kind of out of luck because antidepressants don't come in injectable form. And again, I'm not allowed to like cram a pill down this kid's throat against his will. That's very cruel and inhumane and unsafe. And antidepressants don't actually work all that great for a lot of people. They have efficacy, or they're effective in about 30% of folks, and they take like 2 months to work. So this is not a helpful threat mitigation strategy, even if the depression was the thing that was really driving the whole of his risk, which it's probably not. The one place that this does work, and this is like such a small subset of people, but I did bring it up at lunch, is situations where the person's risk is driven by psychosis for some reason. So delusions, auditory hallucinations, false beliefs that are driving their behavior. So I'll cite some examples of a woman that I saw who had stabbed her neighbor in the neck because she believed that the neighbor was poisoning her food, sending signals through her electrical system in her house, causing her and her family to be toxic. And she was acting in self-defense. She probably wasn't a homicidal murderer at baseline, but she thought she was protecting herself and her family because she was very psychotic at the time. Or people who, and someone had mentioned Aaron Alexis earlier, who perpetrated an act of violence in the Navy Yard, was driven by this delusion that the government was trying to torture him with ultra low frequency radio waves. In cases like that, and we've seen a few of these, the Aurora movie theater shooter, the guy who shot Gabrielle Giffords, it is probable that they were in the throes of psychosis and that they would have benefited from antipsychotic treatment, and those do come in an injectable form. And those are the kinds of things we can get court orders to give to people, even if they don't want them. And it is a heartbreaking part of my job to see somebody who is so sick that they are completely delusional and scared, and in the mindset that people who are trying to help them are trying to hurt them. And our solution for that is to hold them down and inject them with a medication against their will. It is not something I strive for. So this is kind of a last resort, this involuntary medication. That being said, I will do it because I have seen people go from living in bushes for months at a time, their mothers and fathers worried, sick, and calling me in tears, to being able to go back to college. And as a friend of mine once said about pediatrics, you have to like kids enough that you're willing to hurt them to help them. That's how I feel about my patients sometimes, is that I have to do these things I really don't want to do, and they don't want me to do, because in the long term, it is in their best interest. But it is, again, not something I take lightly, and it's that balance of, do they have the capacity to make a decision about their own health care, or are they not in the right mind to do that? And that's what the judge decides when he grants a Reese hearing. Okay, so just want to give another little advertisement for extreme risk protection orders, or as they're known in California, gun violence restraining orders. These are the civil orders that allow for family members, police, and now in California, some school officials and employers to have a person's guns removed because of a concern of suicide or violence in the future. No criminal activity is required, so this is like left of boom kind of situation. Also, and this was one of the things I, as a psychiatrist, advocated for in the multiple states I've testified about these bills for, no mental health evaluation. The reason being, it's not that I don't care about people's mental health, because I do, but we're in the kind of situation where we're not asking why, we're just trying to remove the how, and then we can ask why later. We can think about like, oh, well, is this person depressed? Are they suffering from a psychotic disorder? Do they have, a developmental disability that made them easier to radicalize? It doesn't matter in that moment when they're posting things on Instagram and saying this is going to be, the day of retribution, and they're stockpiling their guns. Let's just get the guns out of the equation. These now, for those of you watching from other states, these are the 19 states in which they've been enacted, and the pink ones are where bills have been proposed. So they really have taken off since the Parkland shooting. Like I said, we passed ours in the wake of Isla Vista. But Florida was one of the next states who, they're not real quick to pass firearm prohibition laws. So they acted very fast after Parkland, and other states have followed suit, because this is one of the tools that is really useful when you're in that situation where, like, law enforcement is really hoping the mental health system will fix these problems, and the mental health system is really hoping that law enforcement will fix the problem, and we're kind of hot potatoing these risky patients back and forth. As I mentioned, there's no provision for healthcare providers in California. You can, if you're a healthcare provider in Maryland and Hawaii, you can petition. But what I've done in the past is called law enforcement, and everybody says, oh, the HIPAA police are going to come for you. I copied and pasted this language from the DHS website as a reminder about HIPAA, that if a patient makes a serious and imminent threat of violence, the clinician can disclose PHI that is necessary to prevent the threat of violence, and to a person reasonably able to prevent or lessen the threat. So that means law enforcement, that means one of the peer partner programs, that means school officials, that means maybe other kids who are part of the threat. And then they double down and say, HIPAA expressly defers to our professional judgment in making determinations about the severity of the threat. So I read that as like, we're not going to come after you and say, like, well, this wasn't exactly serious. They don't want people using HIPAA as an excuse to not collaborate with other agencies, to not get all the players at the table and share information that's necessary. And that's the end of my slides. So I'm going to hand it over to Mark.
Why isn't this working? Is it working? Sorry. So my name is Mark Gale, and I am not a JD, MD, PhD, or a PsyD. I have no letters after my name, but I am an expert of being the father of a son with schizophrenia. So that makes me a doctor of dadology. That's my bad joke for the day. I'll stop there. I'm a NAMI member. Do you all know who NAMI is? You must. You don't? Anybody who doesn't? We're the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We've been around California since '78, nationally since '79. We're a self-help grassroots support, education, and advocacy organization. When you know a family and they're just finding out their kid has a serious mental illness, we're who you want to send them to, okay? I've been a support groups facilitator for 20 years with them. And I'm actually backing away from that role. A lot of the things you were talking about, like, well, what do you do when he won't engage? You know, so I spent a lot of time talking to parents about what I had to do when my son wouldn't engage. And my son also committed crimes. So he started to become psychotic at 13 or 14. And his behavior, you know, we did everything that most families would do. You go to the guidance counselor at the school, you talk to the dean, right? You come in, he's getting suspended for his behavior. His behavior starts to get off the charts. You find a therapist to try to help, which he hated. Maybe you try an antidepressant, you know, that takes 6 weeks to start to work. My son was hospitalized twice as a juvenile, 8 more times as an adult, all voluntary, thank goodness, except for the last one. And we almost lost him twice. And he also spent a year of his life in Twin Towers, just down the street. So, and for those of you who don't know the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, that's our jail. Actually built to be a maximum security jail, but that's where the mental health population is. So my intersection with the criminal justice system intersected with my finding out my kid had a mental illness all at the same time, because we were in juvenile court too. And so consequently, I've been an advocate for the decriminalization of the mentally ill for 20 years. So I'm NAMI Greater Los Angeles County Criminal Justice Chair for the last 8 years. I was also on the NAMI California Board of Directors for 6 years, 5 of which I chaired criminal justice at the state level, worked a lot with the prison system. I'm also, because I'm interested in systemic change, I worked with Judicial Council, and I'm on the Collaborative Justice Courts Advisory Committee for Judicial Council. I have been for a bunch of years, and just re-upped for another term because I love working with Judge Stephen Manley from Santa Clara County, who's my hero. And I get to be on his mental health subcommittee, which is a great way to try to maybe have an impact on legislation. So I've been at this a while, and there's a presumption, an assumption in the audience with some of the other speakers that when they make a mental health referral, somebody shows up. You know, so there's like divert to what? Divert to where? Divert to who? So we call the 800 access line for LA County, and you know, if you're lucky, you get PMRT, which is Psychiatric Mobile Response Team, 2 clinicians, no officer. Maybe they're there in 4 or 5 hours. Maybe tomorrow, maybe not at all. The county's real focused on the homeless, but if you're just a regular old family and your kids lives with you, and what do? You know, so you know, you mentioned ER boarding. I have no sympathy for acute general hospitals that won't hire a psychiatrist 24/7 to take care of the problem of police have nowhere else to drop anybody. All the psychiatric inpatient beds, and we've got 1,000 of them in the county, but they're all full. And they don't get anybody well. There is no recovery in an acute inpatient hospital. And by the way, I push real hard for more acute beds and IMD beds, which are a subacute level of locked residential care. And I'm real involved in that with the county. We push really hard, and we just got a unanimous motion by the Board of Supervisors to build a non-correctional secure mental health facility with 500 beds. Because a crusade of mine is to get the felony incompetent to stand trial guys out of jail and into a therapeutic environment. And these are people that are on a waiting list to go to the state hospital, because when you have a felony and you commit a serious and violent crime, you're going to go to this, and you're incompetent to stand trial, you're supposed to go to a state hospital. We're the only county that has 550 beds funded by the Department of State Hospital. In a non-locked, community-based setting run by the Office of Diversion and Reentry for competency restoration. And it's very successful. And so we want everybody we can avoid sending to the Department of State Hospitals as a plus. If we can do that successfully in the community, that's great. But what about all the guys where the judge and the DA says, I'm sorry, you know, he committed an offense that's way too severe. Maybe he committed murder, you know, or, you know, any kind of really, really serious crime. They're not going to let them go to an unlocked facility. You know, so we push real hard because we think we can put them. Well, the reason I know this is that when my son was arrested as an adult, and they wanted to send him to prison, and his crime would have sent him to prison. And I spent 5 years keeping him out of prison. I learned all this the hard way. I'm not an academic, you know, and everything I learned from people who were friends and mentors who helped guided me when I knew nothing. And we have 50 locked IMD beds in LA County. By the way, we had 50 20 years ago in a county of 10 million people. We still have 50. We got 20 more, you know, 10 years ago. They lasted 2 years. They took them away. We still have 50 beds. So we haven't gotten anywhere. But one of those 50 beds, the judge said, I don't need to punish this kid. I know he's sick. We don't have to send him to CDCR, to the state prison. But I will not allow this young man to be in the community. But if I have a locked option, we can try it. And that bed, that locked option, saved my son's life from going to state prison. So it's always been a big issue for me, because we should have more of that. If you can stabilize somebody for 6 months to a year in a subacute facility and then step them down into community integration, we can rehabilitate lives. And my son would refuse medication, refused help. I moved him every 90 days for 10 years to keep the court happy. I had to keep him in a program. He didn't live home after age 16. I had to send him, for those of you in California, if you remember the old law, AB 3632, I'm an old AB 3632 dad, and I had to send, because we don't have locked facilities for children in the state of California, he ended up in Utah. And maybe the hardest thing I've ever had to do was after an attempted suicide, which happened to coincide with when we were planning to send him, have two big guys come to this hospital and take him to Utah. And I had to get the funding through in time, and it was all a nightmare. And they didn't get it. They didn't really help him either, but it kept him alive. And this is not a sad story because many of you are clinicians. There's a term called anosognosia, which is lack of insight. Anosognosia means I'm too sick to know I'm sick. If you think Jesus is talking to you through the TV, you're probably pretty sick. If you think your mom is poisoning your food, or the CIA and the FBI are parked outside and they're stalking you, you're pretty ill individual. You're not, and that's real to them. That's as real as this chair, and they will believe that that is truth. And of course, everybody around them knows it's not truth, but you can't get them to take medication because their answer is, there's nothing wrong with me. Why don't you take the medication? I think it's your problem, not my problem. So I'm not a clinician. I run support groups. Families say, what do you do? I make a contract. My contract was, you'll see your psychiatrist, you'll take your meds. I couldn't get him into therapy, but if he would at least take the medication, I'd go with that because for him it's key. If my son doesn't get his meds in 5 months, he will be a psychotic mess. Luckily, he's not refractory and meds work for him. And by the way, an LAI, a long-acting injectable, saved my kid's life. So and it was a doctor, it was last 5150 that said, why won't you take your meds? You've been in and out and going through all this. He was homeless 4 times. He was in jail 4 times for a year of his life. I mean, it was really dark 15 years, folks. And he said, I hate pills. And he said, and thank God for this doctor. I don't even know his name. But he said, look, if I could give you an injection every 2 weeks, would you do it? He says, no pills? So remember that, docs. And he said, no pills. All right, I'll try it. That led to an LPS conservatorship, which only lasted 6 months, because at the end of 6 months, he was no longer a danger to me or gravely disabled. And we terminated the LPS conservatorship after 6 months. And but he started to gain insight around 26, 27. Dad, I'm not good. I'm not right. I think maybe I should go to the hospital. Well, why don't we get you in the doc and we'll tweak your meds and we'll see if that works and if we need to go to a hospital. But we could talk about it after years of not being able to talk about it. And my son turned 40 in February, and he hasn't been in a hospital in 14 years. And he lives, he deserves that applause. And he went through hell. And he lives independently in the community with a little bit of financial help from his family. And thank God we can help him because we have the resources to be able to do it. I know a lot of families that don't, and their kids are homeless, right, because they can't let them live home. I couldn't let my son live home. And we brought him back for 6 weeks, and I had to ask him to leave again, which is really painful. So there's just so many issues, but we keep thinking we have a functioning mental health staff. If you went to the mental health director now and said, I'll give you an extra $1 billion, fix the system, the first thing Dr. Wong would say to you is, it won't help because I don't have anybody I can hire. Because every month they're trying to hire maybe 100 to 125 clinicians. So it's not just money. People have left, right? COVID, telehealth, clinicians have decided there's an easier way than being on the street at 3 a.m. The system doesn't work, and the system isn't functioning, and we can't get people the help they need. So I'm not talking people with mild to moderate mental health conditions. I'm talking about people with the most severest form of severe and persistent mental illness. If they don't get the level of care that they need, I call it, there are 5 catastrophic outcomes, okay? And those are, they will end up in jail, they will end up in prison, they will end up in a state hospital, homeless or victimized, and too often death. And the people that come to me for help and the people that I advocate with at both the state and local level are all families like mine, who have been failed and jailed and streeted and boarded, and we've run the gamut, and we need everybody in the system and in particular, I think clinicians and doctors to really bring truth to what's going on, and if you do criminal justice work long enough as an advocate, that's why I brought up the felony incompetent to stand trial, because I think it's one of the greatest civil rights issues of our time, and nobody's talking about it. I'm talking about it. I'm talking about it because this is the dumping ground of human beings that are too hard, too challenged. They've committed a serious crime. They're often aggressive or violent. And the best thing that society seems to be able to come up with is to put them behind bars and let them rot. And it's awful, and it's horrific. And the conditions in our jail are horrific and horrible, and they're not complying with the consent decree from the Department of Justice. I mean, I could just go on and on. There's just all sorts of problems. And we need to solve these. So we advocate very strongly. I'm always in touch with Board of Supervisors staff on motions and bills and whatever we can do. And one of the keys is Senate Bill 43 by Senator Eggman, who is trying to rewrite the definition of grave disability. I've been working on that issue for a decade. We're still working on it because LPS law doesn't work. So nothing exists in a vacuum. Am I going on too long? Nothing exists in a vacuum. There's a federal piece. I'll do my clock. 12 o'clock, the federal piece. There's the IMD exclusion. When Congress passed CMS law, what was it, 63, 65, Medicare, Medicaid, okay, they said we don't want to pay for state hospitals. Any institution greater than 16 beds gets no federal financing participation dollars. That's called the IMD exclusion. That's why every time you go to an acute inpatient facility, it's 16 beds or less. Ask any director that runs one, and they'll tell you, I don't have enough patients here and enough cash flow to sustain this business, so we're always losing money. And then the beds close. If it's a private hospital, they can just close them. The county eats it, okay? So that's the federal piece. Then there's the fiscal discrimination. Follow the money. There's the fiscal discrimination built into state law, which is mental health 1991 realignment revenue, which hasn't grown since 1991. It's been $1.2 billion forever. There's a little bit of growth formula. Maybe you get 5 or 6% more money. That's the money that builds acute inpatient facilities, subacute IMD facilities, clinics, all the stuff that the Mental Health Services Act, which is dedicated to the voluntary outpatient system, does not pay for. So the state has been starving the part of the system that serves the sickest of the sick. Is it any wonder they're intense on the sidewalk or in jails and prisons? And the percentage of people with serious mental illness in our state who are in jails and prisons is rising all the time, because we seem to be able to find ways of getting people out who don't have a mental illness, but there's nowhere to put the people who do have a mental illness. So the state prisons do realignment, but now 40% of the prison system's seriously mentally ill. Twin Towers, 40% of the male population in our jail system in LA County has severe and persistent mental illness. And a really scary statistic, lady clinicians work on this. Why are the percentage of women in the women's jail, 66% of them have a severe and persistent mental illness. 66%. So we are failing women in this county, many of whom are people of color, all right, come from low socioeconomic backgrounds. But what's going on with the women? Why are the men 40 and the women 66? So we need somebody with some research skills who can answer that. I keep bringing that up in public meetings. Everybody goes, gee, that's terrible, but nobody does anything about it. So these are the kind of issues that I work on because, frankly, I'm the guy in the room who can say things that all of you can't when your boss is sitting there. All right, and I do. I bring it up publicly. I bring it up to the county. We got to make waves, and we got to be loud. But we need more voices than just moms and dads. You know, we need, because when a psychiatrist stands next to me and confirms this, and you approach it differently than I approach it, you know, you're going to be able to speak in a different language than I can because of your area of expertise. It just adds more credibility to the argument. So we're fighting like hell in the state capitol to try to get laws changed that work, all right? Yeah, I work on involuntary treatment. I'm with the Treatment Advocacy Center. You're here talking about violence. If you haven't read E. Fuller Torrey's writings over the last 20, 30 years, no one's done more work on the serious mentally ill and violence than Fuller Torrey. But if you boil down a lot of his great research, and really this is really old research, what he found is people with paranoid schizophrenia who hear commanding voices telling them to do negative things, who are untreated and mix that with substance use disorder, usually meth, that's a big, big amount of the homicides that occur. When you move away from that population, then you can say the usual line, which is people with mental illness are no more dangerous than anybody else. But that little subset is where a lot of the homicides occur. So, and you should be looking at Dr. Torrey's research for identification of the population that's causing all those kinds of problems.
Does it, okay. I thought maybe Stuart gave me this one on purpose. Wow. Okay, so I am holding two competing feelings right now that I just want to share. And one is feeling a little overwhelmed by the ways in which our systems are failing. And the other is blown away by the commitment to change, the innovation, the willingness by people like you to wade in where it is so fraught with challenge and frustration, and to doggedly work to make the system better. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to both of you. Amazing, amazing work. And then I have some, this will surprise you, I have some questions. And then I'll try to make room for others to have questions as well. Okay, both of you in many ways were talking about the involuntary space. But the reality is there's this sort of porous boundary, right? So people are moving from the involuntary space to the voluntary space all the time. I'm in the voluntary space where I find it very hard often to engage people. And what I'd like to hear from you is, what have you seen that helps to sort of smooth the passage so that when you have someone leaving your space, it's more likely that they will engage? And what can we as providers do? What can you as people from on the involuntary side kind of, or what parents, like what can be done to make that transition work better so that we don't have people sort of leaving the involuntary space and then falling into an abyss and then coming back to you the next cycle?
You want to hit that one? Or you go first. Well, you know, for me, I have no LPS designated powers, so I couldn't put him in a hospital, you know, except one time when he said all the magic words. You know, I sat in a parking lot for 5 hours waiting for the psychiatric mobile response team to show up on his last hospitalization. And I was in a trailer. He was doing a room for rent. He was on a trailer on the property. And it was the one time in my life, really the only time that I was really afraid of my son. And being knowledgeable about mental health law, as he was threatening to hurt me, I was counting them because I knew I'd need it in court. First time, second time, third time, he threatened to kill me once. Fourth time, fifth, threatened to kill me again twice. And I'm like counting all this up so I could remember it for court because I knew I was going to need it. And all I could do as a dad, and in my support group, what I tell the families is everything's got to be really clear and simple. You can't tell somebody with severe and persistent mental illness, well, call the psychiatrist, for God's sake. Here's the phone number, and set an appointment. Because they're not self-starters. But if you facilitate that, let me make the call, let me make the appointment, I'll give you a ride, we're going to go Wednesday, and I'll come with you. Maybe you can gain some engagement. The only thing I could do as a dad, right, and I had to take a really strict line, because if he screwed up, he was going to prison. I mean, I had judges in court saying, young man, if I see you again. So, and my son, he had to surrender before he would take a pill. And so my actions had to mirror what he was doing. So if he was abusive and to the family and was constantly stealing from us and not taking his meds and not complying with his probation orders and all this kind of stuff, then he did not see me as much. I still showed up on Friday after work, took his SSI check, went and bought him groceries, brought the groceries home. But he didn't get to go to a movie, or I didn't take him out to dinner, and I didn't show up on Sunday to take him to lunch because he wasn't complying with, I wanted to meet me halfway. When he would take his meds, see his doctor, comply with his probation officer, basically it wasn't about getting a job, make money, help pay rent. It wasn't about any of that, or go back to school. It was just engaging in treatment. When he did that, then he got 150% support. I was there. We did fun stuff. I take him to the movie, and out to lunch, and I visited my son, every week, once or twice a week for 10 years while I was moving him around from program to program. And when he wouldn't do what I wanted him to do, then I had to pull back. And that at least showed him there was going to be a reaction from the family when he wouldn't engage.
So to take that incredibly beautiful story and kind of put a boring label on it. So that's like harnessing informal systems to incentivize treatment. I don't know, I just made it up, but I told you, I feel better when things are in boxes with labels. So those are
informal systems.
Harnessing so that's, which is huge, actually. Huge, because often we don't have other systems to work with. So yeah, and it worked. So that's helpful. That's amazing. You?
Well, and this makes me think of, is this one? Is this working? Yes. Okay. So many of the patients I see don't have a dad in their life who can be the informal system that is harnessed and be their sort of case manager, grocery shopper, social worker, all of those things. And so what I've seen work really well on the semi-rare occasion that it's worked. But I'm thinking of one case who was brought in by the FBI of a kid who was making all kinds of threats, posting things on Instagram. The FBI was like, here, please fix him. And I was like, I don't think I can. I'm not really convinced he's mentally ill. And it was sort of this back and forth. And, they filed a GVRO. I held on to the kid. Miraculously, the judge kept him because it wasn't really clear. He was young enough and just a little bit odd enough that we thought maybe this guy is being driven by some delusions or some voices. And we weren't like 100% sure. And Parkland had just happened. And so I think the judge was like, and I'm not 100% sure either. So he can stay. We kept him for a long time. And by the time he was ready to go, we had harnessed this really great, we talked earlier about when you turn 18, you time out of the kids system. We have a transitional age youth or TAY system in Sacramento. He was wrapped into that. It's like a full service case management, all kinds of people in your court. He didn't have family that was in any way constructive, but he had a lot of people looking out for him that were clearly in communication. And I don't even want to call us a united front because by the end we were a united team with him. He wanted the new housing. He wanted to switch school districts. He wanted the job support. He wanted to get out there into the world. And there was this team that started meeting with him while he was inpatient, meeting with his inpatient psychiatrist, all together saying like, hey, look, we're your family now. We're the people looking out for you. And he got to know them while he was inpatient. It was a warm handoff to the outpatient system. He knew that everybody was looking out for him, and it worked.
That's what it's supposed to look like.
That's what it's supposed
when
to
it
look
works
like.
the way,
Yes.
When you
yes.
have a substitute for the family, the system.
Okay. Thank you. So, Mark, you had mentioned this idea of even if there was an enormous sum of money, even if we had resources, that's not actually the problem. So I did want to ask the magic wand question of both of you, because I am feeling a little overwhelmed by the brokenness of the system. Where would you wave your wand? You know, what do you think would help to shift things here so that our system worked for these complicated kids that are right at that intersection of the criminal justice and mental health system? Because that's who we're talking about.
Do you want to hit that one?
I have a wand waving ask. I mean, obviously the R word, I would say, but it is beyond that. I'm going to throw this one out there, not necessarily because it's my top choice, because it's the most controversial choice, and I'd love to hear Mark and other people's opinions on it. I would actually lower the thresholds for involuntary treatment, and I would expand who qualifies. And are you nodding or are you shaking your head in disgust? Okay. Thought he's going to push me over. This is a really unpopular opinion, because what I'm basically saying is I want to take away more people's civil rights, right? And so this is not the kind of thing you can say, but I found that overwhelmingly parents of families or parents of kids or other family members who have serious mental illness, they want their kids to get in treatment faster and they want them to stay longer. And what happens now is you have to be, you have to be sort of right of boom. Like the boom doesn't have to be necessarily a public act of violence, but a suicide attempt, a very serious threat. You're so gravely disabled that you're eating out of trash cans, living on the street for 2 weeks under a bush in the pouring rain. Things have to be really bad for you to be brought in and kept. And then there are a lot of limits in terms of the time that you can be kept, and you can't be involuntarily medicated unless you get that other court hearing. And so many of these things don't apply to the kids and the young adults, or sometimes the middle-aged adults that we're talking about making these threats. They're not really meeting the criteria. So I think that both from the perspective of helping, this seriously mentally ill kids and young adults like your son, like so many others who bounce in and out of the system, but also capturing and being not in a sort of like throw net over them sense, but like identifying and bringing in so many of these kids at risk of targeted violence and also suicide, because those two things go hand in hand. We would be able to do that better if we had lower thresholds for involuntary commitment and treatment. And I think that it probably is worth it. Part of that is also expanding assisted outpatient commitment or involuntary outpatient treatment. California has this that's called Laura's Law, where you don't have to be in an inpatient hospital. You can have a court order in place to have to take your medication, to have to do certain things regarding your housing, to have to answer to certain people. And it's been really effective, not just in getting people who are sick better, but actually in reducing violence by people with mental illness. They're not causing most of the violence in the world, but in New York, it's called Kendra's Law for the guy who pushed a woman named Kendra into one of the trains. And in California, it's called Laura's Law for a young woman who was working at a mental health clinic and was shot by one of the clients and killed. So assisted outpatient treatment is really been shown to be effective for both illness improvement and violence reduction. In California, it is up to the discretion of the counties, and many counties, including mine, don't really have a program right now.
Actually, now they have to.
Yeah, now they have to.
Now they have, if they opt out, they have to state why. We got that law through. So the medical profession's got this figured out. I mean, if somebody comes into the emergency room and they're unconscious and they've been stabbed or shot, that patient is unable to make informed consent. Somehow we've got a method. I don't know if you're calling a judge at 2 a.m., but
no, we just take care of them.
You take care of them. You save their lives. So we base our involuntary commitment statutes on what we observe in behavior: danger to self, danger to others, gravely disabled person, unable to fulfill your personal needs for food, shelter, and clothing. You don't get to informed consent till you get to the Reese hearing, right? So that's what's wrong with our definition of grave disability. Does the person lack the capacity to make informed consent? If they can't make informed consent, then they should be able to be detained. And then we want good docs in good acute inpatient setting. And by the way, I advocate for that too. We need to, client coalitions are always fighting against hospitalization or anything that's involuntary or coerced. But they could help a great deal by bringing recovery into acute and subacute settings. All right? Bring your knowledge of psychosocial recovery into an acute and subacute settings, and teach both staff, doctors, and patients those tools, as well as just being medicated, against one's will. Or, the patients figure it out. If I accept the medicine, I'll get discharged. We're trying to get medical added to food, shelter, clothing, and medical with a precise definition of medical, both physical illness and psychiatric illness. Psychiatric illness kills too. As part of the definition, a good friend of mine, Dr. Susan Partova, who works just a few blocks from here in Skid Row, runs homeless health care for LA. She's got homeless people on the street with very serious mental illness, and they've got, gangrene and diabetes and COPD. And she says, she's not a psychiatrist, she's a straight MD. Come on into the clinic and let me treat you. And they won't let them treat her. They won't let her treat them because of their mental illness. Isn't that gravely disabled? If you've got open sores on your body and you're living on the street, so everything's out of whack. We got to change these laws. Laws are written by people. We can correct them.
All right. So my last question is one that I'm actually going to open to anybody who wants to wade into it, because I think it's come up, kind of bubbled up on different panels in different ways. Amy, you put up a slide about the HIPAA police. And I have a friend in the FBI who says to me, there is no HIPAA police. So that is true. And I think we have talked today about the importance of not getting hung up when grave danger is on the line by, can I not say, the importance of letting people know when there's real concern. We get that. And I play in the voluntary space over here where people have a choice about coming in to see people in our program. They have a choice to talk to us or not. And if they don't trust us that we're going to be a safe place to talk, they just won't come in. And then there goes our last chance to have somebody engaging with maybe a kid who's dropped out of school and sits in his room all day. It's just like there's a value to being super clear that a mental health provider is not going to go talking about what you're telling them unless it's imminent risk. Okay, so it's so easy. You just have to know if it's imminent risk. How do we, nobody knows that. Like there's a gray area is so complex and so murky and like this morass that we have to wade through of, should I break confidentiality with my client? Should I tell the threat assessment team that I'm working with what is going on clinically? Because maybe there's a piece of the puzzle here that if the team had it, they would make a judgment call that there's real risk. But I have 500 pieces of the puzzle because this kid comes in and talks to me every week. Do I put all 500 pieces of the puzzle on the table and blow that confidentiality? So I just want everybody to like sit with me in my in my discomfort with how do we know? We all want to tell if it's going to save a life. None of us want to tell if it's just breaking confidentiality, but the world between those two poles is huge. So how do we think about it? Anybody? I'll answer that. Oh, thank you.
I mean, I can answer, but I'm happy to hear from the audience first. Anyone else?
I strongly disagree that there's no HIPAA police. It's basically school and business administrators, insurance underwriters, and criminal defense lawyers. They're the HIPAA police, and they're the ones who collectively have been tying all our hands. Law enforcement, they're, like you said, there is no division in the FBI that will go after HIPAA and all that, but where 90% of the resistance comes that we've seen has been from the administration. The FERPA, HIPAA, they use them as excuses to deny the problem. I mean, the administrations are in denial. They're in more need, I think, of mental services than the students that are after them, because that has been the ongoing thing. I mean, look at what goes on in all the schools. The schools deny bullying for all that, for the most part. I mean, try to get anything with bullying. The person who complains about the bullying gets punished more than the people performing the bullying. And so I think that's where you need to look, is at the, you need to really press hard the administrators, the insurers, and the legal profession. It's broken. I mean, criminal defense attorneys have taken over the country, and we're having a lot of the problems we're having because they're filing all these suits based with no, if you were to try to attack their client with the same attacks they're making on you, it would fall apart because there's no proof. But they can make all these wild allegations and somehow it sticks. It's not a level playing field. It's like you're guilty till proven innocent, but they're innocent even if proven guilty. So we've got to figure out a way to, turn it back around.
Well, I would just agree that the hospital administrators have a much higher threshold of upholding HIPAA than HIPAA requires.
Yes, Heidi, I appreciate you asking this because I think it's something that we all grapple with, and what you're asking about, or the way we think about it, at least the way I think about it as in my practice as a psychologist and then in my role as the supervisor at Life After Hate, is confidentiality is really the right to privacy of the client. And the client has rights, and those codes of ethics that we follow are really about protecting vulnerable people. And so I have to remember that that person that's disclosing this information, either to me as a psychologist or either to our social workers or the peer mentors, does have a right to privacy. And then, on the other hand, as you pointed out, we're trying to balance the safety of society. And there is so much gray area in between that individual's right and the need to protect society. And we don't have clear boundaries in that. But if I shift my perspective and I think about suicide, if this person was saying this, but it was actually a suicide threat, what would I do? What kind of steps would I take if it was just suicide? Would I be churning to a CAMS model, for example, a CAMS intervention, which is an evidence-based intervention management program just for suicide risk? We now have the ability to use the TSAM, which is just for targeted violence risk. But if I think about my decision-making about this balance between protecting that client's rights, protecting society's right, but also protecting that client's ability to live in society after this moment right here and now, where they may be high risk, they may be high threat. What kinds of things do I need to do to intervene in this moment? And sometimes what I have to do is contact law enforcement. Sometimes that is part of my obligation to make sure that they don't end up going and committing that crime that they are indicating that they're going to commit, or at least so that someone else has eyes on them. But it is not an easy decision, and very rarely do people just overtly say to us, I'm going to go do this. When they do, we take it very seriously. We're asking about it, obviously. But much more often, it's these kind of vague allusions to thinking about doing something. I'm going to go out in a big way, as we saw in that in the vignette today. That's much more common. What does that mean? What does that mean for you? So I have both that obligation to query more, hope that they answer me, hope that I can sustain that relationship, but also know that there's a point at which I have to think about really violating that client's right to privacy, that to break that confidential moment, and to report, and to figure out where I report to make sure that we keep society safe. So it is a challenging question. I just don't have a great answer to it. So thank you for asking.
And I know Michael Brown wanted to say one things. Just hold on 1 second.
Just another pitch for the work that McCain Institute has done. There's a document as far as the Practitioners Network has put together, Legal Considerations for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. It's a practice guide for the Practitioners Network on how to use FERPA, how to use HIPAA, what exceptions are out there in this space. It's still an ambiguous place, we get that, but the attempt of that product was to answer these questions instead of being in the speculative space of fearing the HIPAA police, you know. It's page 14. If you pull up the document, I'm sure we can circulate that for those online. But it's a product that addressed this question more than a year ago, as it's something that comes up often, and it gives a streamlined answer for those that are dabbling in the space and unclear of how to function in the space. I'm not saying it's overly prescriptive, but it does at least give a baseline of support to address this question.
Stuart and Richard and.
No, actually, Michael.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not in that space, and it must be a horrible art decision to make. You guys are very capable, as you know, not there's a lot in the field that aren't as capable. So hearing that there's some kind of guideline, less capable.
Thanks for thinking we're capable.
He's delusional.
That's just really bugging you, isn't it? After. I wonder if I can go in a slightly different question, first with just a comment and second with a question. First, Amy, just to mention to you, in New York when we did ERPO, we were able to get the clinical social workers written in as a designated reporting party. And we now train social workers and psychologists throughout the state of New York about ERPO and numerous other things. But it was really a good piece to get into the legislation because social workers are in such a great position to know. And it's really taking on some traction now, which has been great. I have a question. I'm not going to use the R word. If I impose a ban, I stand by the ban. But I do want to ask you a question about this acute shortage of beds, which is an issue we hear about all over the country. So I work in New York. So New York is having a very active conversation now about the transformation of essentially abandoned hotels and office buildings into more practical uses. And we're thinking about all sorts of things. One of the things that's come up is beds for psychiatric patients, as well as people that don't need in-house commitment. I'm just wondering if there's any conversation about that around here. You have a brand new mayor. This is a city that has a long experience with public-private partnerships. You have super active medical community here with some big institutions. Is that part of the dialogue?
Well, I can't speak for LA because I'm from up north, but I'll say a little bit about the state in general. As Mark alluded to, we have really rigid criteria in terms of how many beds we can have in an inpatient facility that's going to bill and what those beds have to be like. And as somebody who has worked in a couple different facilities, I will say that one of the things, I actually was looking at a place recently that I was considering working, and the thing that I most looked to, because the guy was like, do you really need to look around in all the rooms? And I was like, yes, I do, is the architecture and the design of the building, because for safety reasons, it's super important that, everything from like the way the sinks are put onto the walls to the flow of the hallways to the interview spaces. And there's one facility that I've only worked there a little bit, but it was, the way the physical plant was totally unsafe, and it was awful. So I think it's really hard to turn a facility that wasn't built to be an acute psychiatric hospital into one. In contrast, we just built a new one in Sacramento. When I toured there, I was like, oh my God, this place is amazing. Like, they had these special doorknobs that you couldn't put a ligature around, so it didn't pose a suicide risk, because that's common in inpatient facilities, is people will hang themselves on doorknobs or the corners of the doors. But I think that there is potential for that for supported housing for people, But that has to be paired with, for people with serious mental illness, that has to be paired with treatment and case management, or it doesn't work. You can't just leave somebody with, who has serious schizophrenia or bipolar disorder and a bottle of pills and give them a studio apartment and say good luck. You need somebody who's going in every day. They need to have access to a psychiatrist. They need somebody helping them refill their meds, shop for their groceries. They need Mark coming in and, doing all the things he does for his son. So I think it's hard to enact that because it's just such a small piece of the bigger puzzle.
And we've really screwed up the supportive housing part of it because so there was a bill passed, No Place Like Home. So what we did, Mental Health Services Act is the 1% tax on millionaires that funds the outpatient program. They took 7% of those treatment dollars and said, we're going to use those for the homeless. And advocates like myself fought against it, said, that's mental health money. You can't take that for everybody else. Now, if you want to use it for people with mental illness who need supportive housing, we'll buy that, but we're going to have 7% less treatment dollars. So, they did it. They floated a bond issue, and they're using the money to pay debt service. And what did they do with that? I just found this out like a couple of weeks ago. What happened with the No Place Like Home money? How come people in LA County, which is what I know best, with serious mental illness aren't getting permanent supportive housing? Because they threw all that money into the coordinated entry system, which was a statewide system to get the homeless off the street and into Housing First. Well, Housing First works for some. Housing First is basically, we'll put a roof over your head. You don't need to be sober. You don't need to be on your meds. We'll get you a house first, and then we'll take it from there. But for people with real severe mental illness, it oftentimes doesn't work that well, and they don't want to stay indoors, and they go back to the street. The best paper I've read on housing here in California was written by two dear friends of mine. It's called Housing That Heals. Google it, look it up. They did two moms, all right, did a 3,000-mile trek around California, went to all the different facilities, found the best IMD in the state, the best acute inpatient in the state, the best supportive housing in the state. I won't use names, but read it. It's great, and it talks about what people really need, really from a mom's perspective, from the family's perspective. And their kids have been in these places, so they know the difference.
So a sign of a really great meeting is when it's 5:45 and you feel like you're just getting started with the conversation. But it is 5:45, and and we will turn it over to Brett. Thank you so much.